Adam Hart. I teach at Pitt. I write about horror movies and a variety of other stuff, but I've got a book coming out in a couple of weeks called Monstrous Forms. And I help out a lot with the George A. Romero Foundation. We're putting together a bunch of events here in Pittsburgh celebrating the memory of Pittsburgh's favorite master of horror and the creator of the modern zombie genre this October. If you want to know what it feels like to be anxious in an era, look to the horror films. They'll tell you, like, one of the things that horror does, it really pinpoints the things that a culture is worried about. And it might not always be on the surface, but it's there. Well, I mean, the horror genre really starts in 1931 with Frankenstein. Dracula comes out early in the year, and it's a gigantic hit. It's based on a stage play. It's a sensation that wasn't fully expected by Universal, and it was such a hit that this screenplay that had been floating around the backlot of Universal for Frankenstein gets put on the fast track, and that is the first movie that's made to be a horror movie. But there've been scary movies or movies with ghosts and demons and monsters since the very beginning of cinema. You see them a lot in the 1890s and early 1900s, adaptations of Faust or, trick films by people like Georges Méliès or Segundo de Chamon, where the presence of a devil or ghost sort of is an excuse or rationale for doing a lot of trick films. You get a few kind of more elaborate narratives. Around 1910, the Edison Company makes the first adaptation of Frankenstein that's almost unrecognizable today, but is trying to tell a story. Throughout the teens, you have a bunch of ghost stories of various kinds, but it's really not until The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari in 1920. The centennial of its premiere is coming up at the end of February. It premiered February 26, 1920 in Berlin. And it's really not until then that some kind of what would come to be known as a horror aesthetic starts to develop. The sort of proto-horror movie, the origin point for what would become the horror genre, is located firmly in the avant-garde. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari comes out of the kind of like cutting edge of painting and performance and, even to a certain extent, music in Germany in the teens, where artists attempting to express the utterly inconceivable trauma of the First World War need to create new kind of non-realistic forms that are more interested in expressing subjective sensation than they are in depicting kind of objective external versions of reality. And that's where Caligari comes from. It's a film that's filled with just kind of radical angles and sets that don't fully make sense, and performances that are so highly stylized that they almost don't read as human. And it's just like a really cool looking film. It's one of those moments, like in the 1920s, you could have an avant-garde that had pretty wide popular appeal. It's this sense of like the derangement of the senses that drives what would be the beginnings of the horror genre. And you'd see that in the Universal films of the 1930s, like to a certain degree Dracula, but absolutely in Frankenstein, which was not coincidentally made by a British veteran whose experience of the war had informed pretty much everything that he made to that point. And so when he is tasked with making a horror film, he looks to Caligari and Nosferatu and the rest of the German expressionist masterpieces of the 20s to find his aesthetic. There is this sense in those early Universal films of a culture trying to deal with something that's overwhelming, something that has happened in the recent past that they can't fully process. Now, there's a lot of other stuff going on in those movies too. It's not coincidental that so many of them, have monsters with a foreign accent or slightly kind of effeminate mannerisms, or, if you think about like King Kong or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, there's some very clear like racial associations with the monster running just below the surface, like almost no longer subtext anymore. And that's there in Caligari, where Caligari is an Italian name. His somnambulous monster is Cesare, also an Italian name, and there's some sense of like foreigners entering into into Germany to to wreak havoc and steal their women or whatever. But that really becomes kind of written into the DNA of the horror film in the 1930s, where there's a fear of the outsider, a fear of the foreigner, that's manifested in the monster. So this sense there's something out there that, as you said, like something that is unstoppable, something that's very scary and that we can't fully understand. Coming in the 1930s after, the huge global trauma of World War I, and then the ongoing anxieties of the Great Depression, the idea that there's something else out there that's going to make it even worse is realistic. It makes sense. These are anxieties that can be expressed in a horror movie through monsters in a way that might not be like quote unquote realistic, but feels more accurate to the emotion of it.
America prepares. All America alters its pattern of life and work to meet the demand for protection.
The period of like classic Universal monster movies really only lasts a few years. By the end of the 30s, they're already into kind of lesser sequels, advanced entries and franchises that can't compete with the originals. And it's a devalued genre. There are initially a few box office and critical successes, but Universal isn't super proud of the associations with horror movies, with macabre monsters, and the sorts of things that give people nightmares. It's not a respectable business to be in. You do have the Val Lewton cycle at RKO. Cat People, I Walked with a Zombie, Seventh Victim, Ghost Ship, a bunch of just really fantastic horror films made for a low budget at RKO that really saved the studio. When Cat People was a hit, it basically offset the losses of Citizen Kane. And it was a huge kind of unexpected hit, but even that only lasted a few years. And that was during the war, 42 to 45, 46 or so. And, there's been some really fantastic writing about Val Lewton, who was a producer and writer and took a very active role in the production of these horror films that were directed by great directors like Jacques Tourneur and Robert Wise, who was an Eastern European immigrant, and there have been some really fantastic writings about the ways in which both the kind of lingering trauma of World War One and his needing to flee Europe informed the kind of horror that he was producing. But after Cat People, there's really nothing that grabs the zeitgeist, and the 40s there's some interesting stuff, but talking about like a horror genre of the 40s is pretty difficult. There's like not enough to really grab onto trends.
Drive away your worries and cares at this drive-in theater, where you will see the finest motion pictures of all time, soon to be released.
In the 1950s, there's a couple of different sort of fads that we see. There's the like radioactive monster, the creature feature that mixes science fiction and horror. Lots of dudes in rubber suits and giant animals and people, and which is, with a couple of exceptions, really considered kid stuff. The sorts of things that kids would want to see in a double bill on a matinee, and that don't really merit any greater consideration. Not that I'm endorsing that assessment, but it's not the sort of thing that requires a serious review from, I don't know, the New York Times or whatever. Really all of the like alien invasion cycle expresses this fear of the outsider, of somebody coming in and infiltrating or changing, or in the more sort of like blunt example, is just destroying your society. And it really sort of preys on this sense of there being like an us and a them. And there's a lot of films along that spectrum that have kind of a variety of ideological readings of it, but they all sort of start from the assumption that there is an us and a them. Like the sort of more progressive versions of that, like The Day the Earth Stood Still, hinge around the protagonist needing to realize that the other, that the outsider, is in some ways like just like us, or is not a threat, or something like that. Whereas something like Invasion of Body Snatchers, the kind of delicious paranoia of it is that you can't tell us from them, but we know that they're out there. We know that we know that they are trying to destroy us and trying to destroy our way of life. But what's so scary is that we can't tell who they are.